But the filling plan that Ethiopia has proposed is variable based on the hydrology, based on the variable rainfall. And it's essentially taking into account the downstream impact. Okay? Yeah. Now, what Ethiopia is saying is that you have the first 2 years of filling. You test the first 2 turbines. In the first year, you impound 4.9 billion cubic meters of water.
Right.
You test the first 2 turbines. In the second year, you impound 13.5 billion cubic meters of water. You test the other 11 turbines. That's all they need.
Yeah.
They don't want any more. Mm-hmm. After 2 years, that's a total of 18.4 BCM.
Yep.
The initial filling target is 49 BCM. Okay? So after you've done those first 2 years, you need to fill another 30 BCM approximately to get to your target of 49 BCM.
Right.
Now, the average flow of the Blue Nile is 49 BCM.
Right.
So if we take the 30 BCM and we divide it into, let's say, a 5-year total,
right,
that's another 10 BCM per year. And what Ethiopia has said is that they will fill the dam in 5 to 7 years, right? So the 2-year range being that if we have some dry years, then that 10 BCM per year will turn into something like, 7 or 8, let's say, and it will take a total of 7 years to fill it. Egypt has not proposed directly that they want the dam to be filled in 15 years. If the dam was going to be filled in 15 years, the reservoir, you'd be talking about, something like 4 BCM out of a total flow of 49 BCM being impounded every year. That's only going to happen if we have, by far the worst, drought in recorded history. And then there might be some arrangements that mean that Ethiopia is only impounding a tiny amount, because there would have to be so little water in the river that they would be committed to passing all of it downstream during this period. So this has been misleadingly reported, and it gives the impression that the parties are further apart than they are on the technical issues. The technical issues here, the hydrological compromises, are not really the biggest stumbling blocks. Instead, the biggest stumbling blocks is the geopolitical rivalry and the politics and the nationalistic posturing we're talking about. We have not had the political circumstances that allow a compromise to be reached. But don't let me give you the impression that these things are, super easy to solve. Of course, if they were, they would have been by now. And the issue is drought mitigation. My description of how this could occur in a way where Ethiopia is happy and Egypt happy downstream, that's in years of decent or better than decent rainfall. If we do have a severe drought, then there is a very serious argument, technical argument, about how much water Ethiopia impounds or how much water Ethiopia releases downstream during filling. And then there's also the issue, if we have a prolonged drought and everyone's reservoirs run down because there just isn't very much water in the basin, and then we have a period after that when people are trying to build up their water storages, again, there's a major thorny dispute about who gets to fill up their reservoir at which rate. And one of the major Ethiopian complaints when they pulled out of the US talks, they said that the proposals from the US for how they were being asked to mitigate drought by releasing water from the storage at GERD, they said that was totally unacceptable. It was far too stringent. It was going to run down their reservoir, reduce power generation, etc. And in fact, Ethiopia went as far as saying that was trying to secure Egypt's 1959 water quota by the back door. So that's the drought mitigation issues got very serious. But like I say, there is certainly a deal to be done. And basically a deal has been done on how this can work during periods of average or above average flows.
But it sounds like you need a new negotiating setup, i.e. another third party, because the Washington talks didn't achieve what they were setting out to achieve, by all accounts. both sides, that is the Ethio and the Egyptian side, by themselves are not going to come to the sort of compromise you're talking about. I've heard the idea that perhaps the African Union, perhaps alongside the European Union could get involved, and perhaps there could be some economic, financial element to this. That is to say, Egypt should be paying some sort of metered compensation to Ethiopia if Ethiopia has to slow down on the filling and therefore deprive its country of the revenue from generating electricity. Does that look like it's a possibility? It might be on the cards in the coming months?
There's a couple of parts to that. I think there is a problem in terms of the type of talks that we have, like who facilitates them, what's the role of the US.
Yep.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is talk of reconvening. And I think the focus is on a trilateral process, but then I imagine that there will be some third-party international kind of facilitation observation. That would be something Egypt would be keen on. Ethiopia would be saying, okay, but we cannot get into the circumstance that we did in January and February, where these third-party observers are drafting texts and sort of cajoling the parties into signing them. That's what Ethiopia has balked at. So there is definitely an issue there, but I don't think it's insurmountable. Ideally, what we need to happen is for the US to look at the situation and say, well, we made great progress here. Major work on these technical elements. Yeah, we fell down on this drought mitigation issue and it wasn't handled brilliantly, but there's a lot to work with there. Let's pick up this process. And if it needs to be expanded internationally and put back in an African context, fine. But it essentially does look like it's still a US file. Prime Minister Hamdok from Sudan was suggesting that it's about the Washington process. We know that Egypt initiated the US involvement, and Ethiopia, while criticizing the US strongly and rejecting the US elements of the US drafted treaty, Ethiopia has also not formally pulled out of the process. So it does have to be reformulated, but that is not insurmountable. In terms of the compensation scheme, which is something that came from a German think tank, I think down the road, these sorts of issues of how to compensate each other for losses, agriculture, water, electricity, what it may be, that might be part of the package at some point when we get a kind of bigger bargain over the Nile or a comprehensive agreement. And what people have to understand is that you cannot buy off the Ethiopians at this stage. This is an absolute national priority. There's a huge amount of domestic pressure on the government to forge ahead with it. You can't just bung them some cash and say, can you just slow down on that? Especially when there is no hydrological reason for them to slow down anyway, assuming average or above average rainfall. So Ethiopia is going to proceed with its filling plan as set out. But there is a need, as we've discussed, to come to an agreement on these issues, and there's the thorny issue of drought mitigation to manage. But I don't think any sort of compensation package is going to be a sort of clincher over the next few weeks or months. And also, if we're thinking about compensation, then quite prominent in the Egyptian, the pro Egypt sympathetic narrative recently has been the concept of farmland losses as a result of GERD's filling. Now, I think that's there's plenty of reason to doubt some of the claims that have been made. But if compensation is being chucked around, well, then it's Egypt who perhaps most immediately would be suffering economically in these circumstances. So maybe compensation could more easily flow that way. The idea of getting Ethiopia to delay, especially when there's no reason to delay, is basically a non-starter, I think.
You've set out the stakes for the dispute between Ethiopia and Egypt over the filling of the dam. And you mentioned in the course of that, there are big political consequences for both sides. El-Sisi as the sort of ultimate ruler in Egypt and the Arab world in some eyes, and certainly for Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia and the national pride that Ethiopia has invested in this dam, because a lot of Ethiopian citizens have actually paid money to build this dam. So it's not just like some big super World Bank-backed project. It's very much a collective national project which kind of captures the spirit of the Ethiopian people. So I wondered if you could sort of spell out some of the political imperatives driving Abiy Ahmed's policy on this dam and how he might shape strategy.
Yes, no, absolutely. This is a really critical issue because I think it shapes the type of approach that Ethiopia, the sort of constraints on Ethiopia's approach to the GERD negotiations. So, as you've described, I don't need to go over it again. This is a hugely important project for Ethiopia. And then what happened in February is that this idea that Ethiopia is denied its rights to the Blue Nile River through various forms of external interference and pressure, with the US role in February, that really rose to the surface again. The consequences of this are that Prime Minister Abiy, domestically, because of the domestic attitude, he does not have very much room to maneuver in terms of the GERD negotiations. Now, I know that the other leaders in the other countries obviously have their domestic situations and audiences to deal with as well. But just focusing on Abiy, it's very, very difficult politically for Abiy to make any sort of major concessions here. So we've talked about this issue of drought mitigation and the US role. Really what we need to happen is to move away from those dynamics and change the optics if we are going to get a negotiated settlement on the Renaissance Dam that does not cause problems for Abiy domestically. But because that's quite a sort of narrow line to tread, there is the domestic preoccupation from Ethiopia at the moment. That's why they're so intent on filling the reservoir without an agreement, and this is what in turn makes it quite tricky for Egypt's partners, Sudan and Egypt, and the other international actors to get a negotiated settlement here, because they seem to have the idea that Ethiopia is going to be pushed around and is eventually going to sort of backtrack and sign this thing that was presented to them. That's not likely to happen. So instead, if we are going to get a negotiated settlement on the GERD, which is not going to cause problems at home, it needs to be an adjusted agreement, and it needs to be something which is sort of definitively not imposed on Ethiopia. When we're looking at a situation, crisis group, with all of these dynamics put together, it does make it look quite difficult to achieve the type of comprehensive agreement on filling an operation the US and the World Bank and the others were trying to strike. Instead, we think that a piecemeal approach might be the best way here. We've got this initial 2-year turbine testing filling period. Can the parties just agree on that, agree to establish a joint institution, dispute resolution mechanisms, agree on which data to share and how to share it, start to formalize cooperation, put all this drought mitigation stuff on the table for another day, but then Ethiopia can proceed with filling without all these allegations of it having not met its international obligations. Ethiopia can proceed with filling, and Abiy and his allies will be able to say that they are committed and have upheld their international obligations without buckling to foreign pressure.
Great. I think that sets out the grand compromise. I guess the question might be now is what chance do we have of something like that getting onto the agenda in the coming months?
Well, I think, as discussed, all the incentives are there for a negotiated settlement. So I think if each party, as I'm sure they've done throughout the process, but if they try and take the concerns of others into account and match them against their interests, then I think the incentives are there for a negotiated settlement. Whether it's on this comprehensive deal for the entire filling operation, or if it's something more limited and piecemeal, just to get the ball rolling, building trust, formalizing cooperation. All of the incentives are there for the parties to make these types of compromises and cooperate over the dam and over the river. And it's going to be hugely harmful if they don't manage to strike that sort of agreement. So despite all of this bad blood and a fairly torturous process,